So the final part of the five-part test is intentional homelessness. Again, loads of myths around about this. The first thing I'd say is that even if you are intentionally homeless, if you are homeless, eligible and in priority need, so the council's finished their inquiries and they are satisfied that you are homeless, eligible and in priority need, but intentionally homeless, the council has a duty to continue to house you for a period of time that gives you a reasonable opportunity to find alternative accommodation. So under the Homelessness Reduction Act, councils can't reach that decision within 56 days of the application being made. So potentially someone's been sat in temporary accommodation for 2 months, 56 days, then the council reaches their decision and they have to give this reasonable period of time, which, some councils differ. I mean, anything between sort of 7 and 28 days is typical. But if you've got someone who really doesn't have any options because they are, for example, barred from every hostel in town, the council would need to potentially give more time to that person to find something else. But essentially, it's not saying that, the council needs to house you until you find alternative accommodation. There just needs to be a reasonable prospect of getting alternative accommodation in that time. So that's the case even if you are definitely intentionally homeless from day one, the council will still need to house you for a good 2 or 3 months, which should give you enough time to get something else in most cases. So that's the first thing to say about intentional homelessness. The second thing to say about it is that it's actually very, very difficult to be genuinely intentionally homeless. You've got to satisfy 3 criteria, all 3 of 3 criteria which are outlined in paragraph 9.7 of the Code of Guidance. And basically those 3 criteria are: you must have deliberately done or failed to do something in consequence of which you lose your last settled accommodation. So you didn't pay the rent, you committed antisocial behaviour from your last settled accommodation. So things like night shelters, women's refuges, if you get evicted or whatever the word would be, barred from those kind of things, that's irrelevant, because the question relates back to when was the last time you had settled accommodation. That's what this question is around. So that's the first one. Next up, the accommodation must have been available for your occupation. So for example, illegal evictions would mean, that wasn't available, so you're not satisfying this criteria, but this isn't really the important one. The important one is the third one. The accommodation must have been reasonable to continue to occupy, which, if you remember from the clip I did on homelessness law, it's the same wording. So, and in the homelessness clip, I talked about the fact that someone might be homeless even though they've got accommodation, but for some reason it's unreasonable to continue to occupy it because they're subject to domestic abuse or harassment from neighbours or something. They can't afford it. They have sort of mobility issues, which means they can't get around in it, so to speak, or can't get to it, and things like that. So that it's the flips. It's the same definition, but we're kind of flipping it on its head. So, for example, if someone was to flee domestic abuse, in one sense, it's a deliberate act to flee the abuse. So you've kind of hit that first criteria, but of course you're not actually intentionally homeless if you flee domestic abuse, because it's not reasonable to continue to occupy. So I remember one of the many cases I've seen in Bedford. The first entry on this individual's notes, and she was fleeing domestic abuse. Was basically that. Client advised me that she's experiencing considerable abuse. I advised her that if she left or if she took her name off the tenancy, she'd be making herself intentionally homeless. From my point of view, it's like, okay, that's a nice, easy compensation claim, because but it's insane that kind of stuff actually not only gets said, but it gets written down. But anyway, so basically, in that situation, yes, it was a deliberate act to, it would be a deliberate act to take your name off the tenancy and have fled. But because you're subject to domestic abuse, it's not reasonable to continue to occupy. And equally, if you deliberately didn't pay the rent, but actually it wasn't reasonable to continue to occupy because the property was unaffordable, you don't satisfy all 3 of these 3 criteria. Again, it makes perfect sense if you think about it. If you were unable to pay your rent because you literally couldn't afford it because you don't have enough income and the rent was too expensive, then even if you get evicted for rent arrears, you are not intentionally homeless. So again, classic myth, council officers will see rent arrears on someone's sort of information and they'll jump to there straight, yeah, you must be intentionally homeless then, when it really just needs challenging. I've only worked with a few people who are actually intentionally homeless. I've worked with lots of people who were told they're intentionally homeless. In one sense, just to kind of make the point that although these kind of terms, they kind of sound very civilized and whatever, another way of saying that is that, people are getting unlawfully denied housing and left homeless because council officers are kind of saying these kind of stupid things like, that you're intentionally homeless because you're fleeing abuse, stuff like that. It's crazy. It's outrageous. So that's kind of, that's kind of how those three criteria would work. And it's interesting, often people getting evicted from hostels, when you look at how much people are having to pay in the hostel, you realise that actually that accommodation was not accommodation that was reasonable to continue to occupy because the service charge was so high. So again, just because someone's got evicted from a hostel workers should still be assisting that person to make a homeless application. I did a whole video about that one, which I feel very kind of strongly about, because I think the hostel sector should do a lot better with this stuff. And then there's another kind of paragraph which is really helpful in the Code of Guidance. So it's, as I say, it's kind of chapter 9 of the Code of Guidance, which you can Google, Homelessness Code of Guidance, you'll come straight up. So 9.17 or 9.17, however you're saying it. And that basically gives some other situations in which, essentially what it's saying is that these so-called deliberate acts or deliberate omissions shouldn't be counted against them. They shouldn't be considered deliberate. So, for example, the first kind of criteria is around rent arrears, which we've kind of covered already. But interestingly, when you get to the third one down, it basically says that something shouldn't be considered deliberate if it arose as a result of a temporary aberration or aberrations caused by substance use, an assessed substance misuse issue, or mental health problems. So if you've got someone who is suffering from mental health issues, which would include substance use or dependent substance use, and they get evicted as a result of something that happened whilst they were effectively had this aberration of their mind, they should not be considered to be deliberately to be intentionally homeless. Which again, you think about how many people are evicted for rent arrears, which kind of in part arise because they are heavily using substances, they're kind of heavily dependent, and therefore their mental capacity is fluctuating and so on, particularly around alcohol use, but not just alcohol use. Those people actually, they're not intentionally homeless under the law. And then finally, there are some more points, but the kind of other one I'll kind of touch on is where someone's done something like drug dealing, which on the surface of it seems really bad, but then when you actually look at the situation, you realise actually they were under duress, for example, because they've been cuckooed. So although they might have been caught drug dealing, when you look into the situation a little bit more, you realise actually they were subject to this horrendous abuse where an organised gang has taken over their accommodation and is basically saying to them, and we've seen this pretty regularly, unfortunately, they're getting threatened and they are actually getting beaten up, and because that in order for them to actually either store drugs in their accommodation or store weapons in their accommodation, or just basically kind of be this kind of this be party to this illegal stuff that's going on. But it's not that they want to do that. It's just that they're under this kind of huge amount of threat and kind of and risk of harm. And again, in one sense, this makes sense, doesn't it? Those people should not be considered to be intentionally homeless. So again, this is the final part of the 5-part test. If if you're having people found to be intentionally homeless, you would assume that that's been basically written down in the Section 184 notification. You've then got 21 days to challenge it, and in the same way that it's not controversial to challenge negative PIP assessments, it shouldn't be controversial for a worker to challenge a Section 184 notification or a decision. Sadly, it seems that it actually is. Sadly, it seems that homelessness workers are under pressure not to challenge these kind of stupid decisions. But that's I guess that's another issue really. But yeah, you should challenge it. If you're seeing if you're working in the interest of the individual you're supporting, you should challenge anything that doesn't seem to be right. And you can do it politely. You can do it through the formal process. You don't have to kind of make a big fuss about it. But that they should be challenged, because this is the difference between someone getting trapped in the hostel system and actually getting their own accommodation when they've got a realistic prospect of never becoming homeless again. So that's the end of the 5-part test that we kind of covered in the series. But as I say, I've done loads of other videos. I do interviews with different interesting people. Do check that out, and do join our Facebook group, Better Homelessness Practice, because that is a place where we're just kind of constantly sharing information, asking questions, just kind of learning from each other in order to better support the people that we're going to be supporting. So yeah, thanks very much for listening. Again, usual Facebook, usual YouTube stuff. like it, share it, whatever, subscribe to us. But yeah, as I said in other videos, it's not enough just to know this stuff. You need to kind of be prepared to challenge councils who aren't following the law. And once you do that a few times, you'll start finding that it becomes very easy to get people housed. We've had people we've got housed where we haven't really had to do anything. We just had to be there. We just had to witness it, make sure that kind of things are recorded properly, and there hasn't even been a fight in order to get people housed. So that is kind of what you can get to if you dig your heels a little bit through a little bit and you persevere with it. So yeah, I wish you all the best with it. You can do a lot of good. You can get people housed in very short amount of time. And very effectively do it very cheaply. So if this stuff interests you, as I say, we've seen in other videos, we do online training, day courses and so on, which are very reasonably priced. If you check out justus.all.uk, there's like a training tab there. You'll see the upcoming dates, and we get really good feedback. We get people coming back, and we get people coming on our other courses. We train people from all over. Loads of different professions have come on, a really wide range of professions, which is great to see, and members of the public as well. So yeah, do kind of check that stuff out. But yeah, wish you all the best in getting your head around this stuff and supporting people into housing.